The 17th of January 1946, Wright Field, Ohio. The snow fell silent over the tarmac. Row after row of silver fighters stood motionless in the cold P-51 Mustangs, hundreds of them, their propellers still, their Merlin engines muted. The war had been over for 5 months. The men who had flown them across the skies of Europe and the Pacific were home now, or trying to be. And the machines that had carried them, sleek, fast, unmatched in range and lethality, sat waiting for a country that no longer needed them. A mechanic walked between the rows that morning, his breath clouding in the frozen air. He had serviced these aircraft during the war, kept them flying, patched bullet holes, replaced shattered canopies. Now he carried a clipboard and a pencil, marking serial numbers for disposal. He paused beside one Mustang, its nose art still visible beneath a dusting of frost, a blonde pin-up girl and the words, Berlin Express. He ran his gloved hand along the fuselage, cold and inert. It had flown 63 missions. It had come home every time. Now it would be melted down for scrap aluminum. This was the beginning of the end for the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that had turned the tide of the air war, the aircraft that had escorted the bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and returned them safely. It had been the symbol of American air dominance, the embodiment of speed, innovation, and industrial might. And now, in the brutal calculus of peacetime, it had become obsolete overnight. The P-51 Mustang had been born out of desperation and genius. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged and England stood alone against the Luftwaffe, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request: build us a fighter. The specifications were demanding. The timeline was impossible, 120 days from blueprint to prototype. But the engineers at North American, led by Edgar Schmude and Raymond Rice, delivered. The prototype flew on the 26th of October 1940. It was fast, nimble, beautiful, but it was not yet a legend. That transformation came later, when the Mustang was mated with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire. The result was a fighter that could fly faster, farther, and higher than anything the Axis could field. By 1944, the P-51 was escorting B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds all the way to Berlin and back, a feat no other Allied fighter could accomplish. The Luftwaffe, once feared and formidable, was broken in the skies over Germany. The Mustang had made that possible. But wars end, and when they do, the machinery of war becomes a problem. By the spring of 1945, the United States had produced over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. They were stationed on airfields across Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, and the continental United States. They had been built in vast numbers because the war had demanded vast numbers. But on the 15th of August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the demand vanished. The contracts were cancelled. The production lines went silent. And the question became, what do you do with 15,000 fighters you no longer need? The answer was as practical as it was heartbreaking. Thousands were scrapped, melted down, turned back into raw aluminum to be repurposed for refrigerators, automobiles, commercial aircraft. The P-51, which had cost the American taxpayer approximately $50,000 per unit to produce over $800,000 in today's dollars, was sold for scrap at $350 apiece. A mechanic who had worked at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, one of the largest disposal sites, later recalled, "We cut them up with torches, wings, fuselage, tail. It was like dismembering something that had been alive." Some were saved. The newly formed United States Air Force, independent from the Army, as of 1947, retained a portion of the Mustang fleet for active duty. But the future, military planners believed, belonged to jets. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, had already flown combat sorties in the final months of the war. The Mustang, for all its brilliance, was a piston-engine relic in an age hurtling towards supersonic speed and missile technology. And yet, the Mustang refused to disappear. Le 27 juin 1950, Daegu, South Korea. Lieutenant Harry Morland climbed into the cockpit of his P-51D, the engine coughing to life with a familiar roar. 5 years after the end of World War II, he was flying the same aircraft over a new battlefield. The Korean War had erupted, and the United States, caught unprepared, had scrambled to mobilize. Jet fighters were still scarce, still unreliable in the rough conditions of forward air bases, and so the Mustang was called back. Morland's mission that day was close air support strafing North Korean positions, hitting supply trucks, providing cover for retreating American and South Korean forces. The Mustang was ideal for this. Its 6 .50 caliber machine guns could shred ground targets. Its range allowed it to loiter over the battlefield longer than jets. Its ruggedness meant it could operate from hastily constructed dirt strips. As Morland dove toward a column of enemy vehicles, he felt the familiar vibration of the guns, the sharp recoil, the smell of cordite. The Mustang had been designed to fight at 30,000 feet over Europe. Now it was fighting at 500 feet over rice paddies and mountain ridges. But it was still lethal, still effective, still needed. The P-51 flew thousands of sorties in Korea, primarily in the ground attack role. It was used until 1953, when sufficient numbers of jets finally replaced it. By then, it had proven something important, that even in the age of the jet, there was still value in a well-designed piston-engine fighter. It had been underestimated, it had been cast aside, and it had come back. But not everyone who flew the Mustang after the war wore an American uniform. In 1947, as tensions escalated in British-controlled Palestine, Jewish paramilitary organizations sought aircraft to defend the nascent state of Israel. They found them in the United States surplus P-51 seconds, sold as scrap or civilian aircraft, smuggled in pieces across the Atlantic. By May 1948, when Israel declared independence and was immediately invaded by 5 Arab armies, the fledgling Israeli Air Force had a handful of airworthy Mustangs. On the 29th of May 1948, Israeli pilot Gideon Lichtman, flying a P-51D, intercepted and shot down 2 Egyptian Spitfires over Tel Aviv. It was one of the first air-to-air victories in Israeli history. The Mustang, once the sword of American air power, had become the shield of a new nation fighting for survival. Israel was not alone. Over the next 2 decades, the P-51 would serve in the air forces of over 25 countries. The Dominican Republic used them to suppress internal rebellions. The Swedish Air Force flew them as interceptors through the early 1,950 seconds. The Royal Canadian Air Force operated them until 1956. The Indonesian Air Force deployed them in regional conflicts. Even the Chinese nationalist forces on Taiwan flew Mustangs against communist MiG-15 seconds during the tense standoffs of the 1,950 seconds. Each time, the Mustang adapted. Each time, it proved that good design transcends the moment of its creation. August 12, 24, Reno, Nevada. The crowd roared as the P-51 Mustang Dago Red screamed past the grandstand at over 400 miles per hour, its engine howling. This was not war. This was racing the Reno air races, where modified warbirds competed for speed and glory. The Mustang, stripped of guns and armor, souped up with engine modifications and streamlined fairings, had found a new purpose: entertainment. By the 1,960 seconds, the Mustang had become a symbol of nostalgia. The men who had flown them in combat were reaching middle age, their memories of the war sharpening with time. Aviation enthusiasts, many of them veterans, began buying surplus Mustangs and restoring them. Some flew them in air shows, performing aerobatics, and mock dogfights for crowds who had never known the war. Others raced them, pushing the old fighters to speeds their wartime pilots had never dared. The P-51 had become a relic, yes, but a living relic. Not a museum piece gathering dust, but a machine still roaring, still climbing, still defying gravity. And there was a deeper resonance to this. The Mustang had been built in a time of existential crisis, when democracy itself hung in the balance. It had been forged by the hands of American workers, many of them women, many of them black Americans contributing to a war effort that still denied them full citizenship. It had been a symbol of what industrial democracy could achieve when pushed to its limits. And now, decades later, it was still flying, still reminding people of what had been won and at what cost. Il 10 aprile 1981, Kino, California. The hangar smelled of oil and lacquer. A team of restorers worked quietly around a disassembled P-51, its fuselage stripped to bare metal, its wings detached and laid carefully on padded sawhorses. This was not a military restoration. This was the work of the Air Museum, later known as Planes of Fame, one of the first institutions dedicated to preserving warbirds for future generations. The Mustang they were restoring had been found in a scrapyard in Texas, half buried, its serial number barely legible. It had flown combat missions over Germany in 1945. Then it had been sold for scrap, forgotten, left to corrode under the sun for 30 years. Now it was being brought back to life, rivet by rivet, wire by wire. One of the restorers, a man named Ed Maloney, stood back and looked at the fuselage. "People ask me why we do this," he said to a visiting journalist. "Why spend so much time and money on an old airplane?" I tell them, because this isn't just an airplane, it's a piece of history. It's a reminder that freedom isn't free, that it was built and flown and fought for. The Mustang, in this new role, had become a teacher. It spoke to school children who visited museums, to veterans who stood before it with tears in their eyes, to engineers who studied its design and marveled at the elegance of its solutions. It reminded a generation born after the war that the world they inherited had been purchased at a terrible price. Today, there are fewer than 200 airworthy P-51 Mustangs in the world today. They fly at air shows, they compete in races, they appear in films and documentaries. Each one is worth over $1 million, sometimes much more. They are maintained by passionate owners, flown by skilled pilots, cherished by communities of enthusiasts who understand that these machines are more than metal and rivets. The Mustang never became obsolete in the way its designers feared. It simply transformed, from weapon of war to instrument of peace, from symbol of victory to symbol of memory, from tool of destruction to object of preservation. There is a photograph, taken in 2019, of a P-51 Mustang flying in formation with an F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced fighter jet in the world. The contrast is stark. The sleek, angular stealth of the F-35 beside the organic curves of the Mustang, separated by 75 years of technological evolution. And yet they fly together, two generations of American air power, linked by purpose and legacy. The Mustang's survival is not an accident. It endures because it represents something beyond its tactical function. It represents the ingenuity of a generation that refused to accept defeat. It represents the sacrifice of those who flew it into skies filled with flak and fire. It represents the industrial might of a democracy that, when pushed, could outproduce and outfight any tyranny on Earth. And perhaps most importantly, it represents memory. The Mustang reminds us that freedom is not a static condition but a constant struggle, renewed by each generation. That the tools we build in defense of that freedom carry within them the values we seek to protect, that even when the war ends, the lessons remain. The snow still falls on airfields like Wright Field, though the rows of silver fighters are long gone. But somewhere, on a clear afternoon, a P-51 Mustang climbs into the sky, its Merlin engines singing, its wings catching the light. And for a moment, the past is not past. It is alive. It is still flying. It is still free.